Imagine a world where love was not the reason for marriage, but rather duty, survival, and social status. Picture a time where your rights were barely your own, and a woman's voice didn't matter, not even in her own home. This was the reality of Victorian marriages. It sounds like something out of dark, historical drama, but believe it or not, this was the truth for millions of people during the 19th century. So, how exactly did Victorian marriage work, and why was it far worse than most people think? Stick around till the end to find out just how much control, or rather lack of control, these marriages involved. You may be shocked at what you discover. When we think about marriage in the Victorian era, most of us imagine romantic images of high collars, long dresses, and carefully arranged social events. Many of us picture the grand marriages of the aristocracy, filled with pomp, ceremony, and perhaps the chance of falling in love. But the truth is far from this idealized image. In fact, marriage during the Victorian era was often nothing like what we see in movies. It was far darker, more oppressive, and often downright brutal. Victorian marriage was shaped by strict social expectations, religious beliefs, and deep-seated gender roles. It was a time where the law gave men almost complete control over their wives and women had limited freedom, both legally and socially. So, what did life really look like for couples in a Victorian marriage? Let's dive deep into the reality of what these marriages were truly like. By the end of this, you'll realize just how restricted life was and how little freedom people had in their personal lives. The role of marriage in Victorian society. Marriage in the Victorian era wasn't just a personal choice. It was a social necessity. It was a way of securing one's place in society, maintaining family honor, and solidifying connections that could enhance one's financial and social standing. In a society where family status meant everything, marriage was a tool for maintaining power, wealth, and security. Love didn't enter the equation nearly as much as we might think today. For women, marriage wasn't a romantic decision. It was often the only path to financial security. Women weren't encouraged to be independent or pursue careers. The idea of a woman becoming self-sufficient outside of marriage was unthinkable to most Victorians. If you were a woman, your worth was almost entirely tied to the success of your marriage. Women were often married off for convenience, to men who could provide for them and their families, not necessarily because of any emotional connection. For men, marriage was a similar affair. It was about securing family alliances, keeping the wealth within certain circles, and ensuring a legacy. Men were expected to marry and produce children to continue their family name. While there was a larger sense of social freedom for men, their marriages were still deeply constrained by society's rules and expectations. For many men, marriage wasn't just a personal relationship. It was a duty they were expected to fulfill. The wedding itself, a grand event but a hard reality. Victorian weddings were beautiful spectacles on the surface. The bride would wear an elaborate white dress, symbolizing purity, and the ceremony would be filled with symbolism and ceremony. But these weddings weren't about celebrating love or mutual respect. They were about setting the tone for a relationship defined by societal expectations. The vows exchanged in a Victorian wedding were not filled with promises of love and understanding. Instead, they included the phrase to love, honor, and obey, which pointed to a clear power imbalance. The concept of obedience, especially for the woman, set the tone for the entire marriage. The bride wasn't merely promising to love her husband. She was agreeing to submit to his authority and to take on the role of being his caretaker and subordinate. For a woman in a Victorian marriage, the wedding wasn't the start of a romantic journey. It was the beginning of a life where her identity and her rights were immediately taken away. Once married, a woman's life became about her husband's wishes, his needs, and his status. She was expected to make her home a reflection of his success, and her own happiness was often secondary to her husband's needs. A Victorian woman's life was shaped by an unspoken rule. Her personal desires and ambitions should never interfere with her duties as a wife and mother. The gender roles. A woman's place was in the home. In the Victorian era, gender roles were rigid and enforced by both social and religious pressure. Women were expected to embody the ideal of domesticity. They were seen as the moral compass of the home, responsible for raising children, managing the household, and maintaining a peaceful, loving environment. Their role was to serve, nurture, and support their husbands. While some women might have found fulfillment in this role, the overwhelming expectation placed on them was emotionally exhausting. The duties of Victorian women were unending. They had to cook, clean, care for children, and attend to their husbands' emotional and physical needs, often at the expense of their own well-being. Society viewed these roles as a woman's sole responsibility, and any deviation from this norm was harshly judged. Men, on the other hand, were given far more leeway in society. They were expected to provide financially, but beyond that, they had a level of freedom and power that women could never experience. Men could go out into the world, pursue careers, engage in intellectual discussions, and socialize, while women were expected to remain confined to the domestic sphere. Men were the public figures, and women were the private ones, creating an unequal power dynamic that was accepted as a status quo. Sexuality and intimacy, a forbidden topic. Victorian society had a complicated relationship with sex. It was seen as a natural part of marriage, yet something that had to be controlled and regulated. Sex was viewed not as a source of pleasure or emotional connection, but as a necessary evil to ensure the continuation of the family line. Women, especially, were expected to view sex primarily as a duty to their husbands. The idea of female sexuality was rarely acknowledged. Women were expected to have sex with their husbands, but they weren't allowed to express any desire for it. In fact, many women in the Victorian era were not educated about their own bodies and had little understanding of their own sexual needs. Intimacy was something that was strictly regulated, and women were expected to endure it without complaint. Men, by contrast, had more freedom when it came to sexuality. While they were still expected to be the head of the household, their sexual desires were generally seen as a natural part of being a man. This created a power imbalance in the relationship, where men were free to explore their sexuality, but women were largely denied the chance to do so. As a result, many marriages suffered emotionally. Women felt neglected, and many men sought infidelity outside the marriage, often with little consequence. The dark side of Victorian marriages, abuse and oppression. The dark side of Victorian marriages is one that is often overlooked. Abuse, both physical and emotional, was all too common in many households. Women were expected to accept their husband's behavior, no matter how cruel or unjust. In many cases, women were trapped in marriages with men who were emotionally or physically abusive. Victorian law didn't protect women from this abuse. If a woman's husband mistreated her, she had no legal recourse. Divorce was a luxury reserved for the wealthy and was nearly impossible for most people to pursue. Even if a woman were to leave her husband due to abuse, the social consequences were severe. She would often be ostracized and forced to live in shame, a fate worse than continuing to endure her suffering. But it wasn't just women who suffered. Children in Victorian homes were often subjected to harsh, authoritarian discipline. They were seen as property of their parents, and physical punishment was a common form of discipline. Emotional neglect was also widespread, as parents were focused more on maintaining appearances than on creating warm, loving relationships with their children. Legal rights and the lack of control. When it comes to legal rights, women in Victorian marriages were severely limited. Once a woman was married, she lost almost all of her individual legal rights. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or control her own money. A woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's, and her entire existence was defined by her relationship to him. Divorce laws were another significant barrier for women. A divorce was nearly impossible to obtain, especially if a woman was the one seeking it. Even if a woman had just cause, such as infidelity or abuse, she still faced an uphill battle. Divorce required extensive financial resources, and the process could take years. For many women, the idea of leaving a marriage was a distant dream because they had so few resources and options. Men, on the other hand, had far more freedom when it came to the legal aspects of marriage. They could divorce their wives with relative ease and could control much of the family's financial matters. This stark imbalance in legal rights kept women in positions of powerlessness and subjugation. The power of the marriage market. The concept of the marriage market was prevalent in Victorian society. Women were seen as commodities, and their value was determined by their family background, beauty, and domestic skills. Marriage was a transactional affair, and women had to navigate a complex set of social rules to make a good match. If a woman did not marry well, she risked being left without financial support. Many women were pushed into marriages with men they did not love simply because they were pressured to find security and stability. Women from higher social classes were expected to marry men of equal or higher status, while women from lower classes had fewer options and less agency. This marriage market dictated many women's futures, and many were left with little choice but to settle for the best offer they received, even if it meant sacrificing their happiness. Women were often raised with the sole expectation that they would marry well, and were encouraged to do whatever was necessary to secure a good match. This led to feelings of powerlessness, as women often had to compromise their own desires and preferences to fulfill societal expectations. The emotional toll, loneliness, and resentment. Victorian marriages were often marked by deep emotional isolation. Women were confined to the domestic sphere, isolated from the outside world. They were expected to keep the home and family intact while never expressing dissatisfaction with their roles. This led to feelings of deep loneliness and a sense of emotional neglect. Husbands, meanwhile, were often distant emotionally, more focused on their work or public life. The lack of connection between spouses led to feelings of resentment and frustration. In many cases, wives felt trapped, unable to voice their feelings or escape their circumstances. This emotional isolation was a central feature of Victorian marriages. The roles were rigid, and personal happiness was secondary to societal expectations. Women in particular struggled with a sense of confinement, as they were expected to be everything to everyone except themselves. Many women found themselves trapped in marriages that lacked any form of intimacy, emotional connection, or shared happiness, leading to long-lasting feelings of bitterness. Victorian marriages were far more than just a contract between two individuals. They were a reflection of the harsh societal structures that governed every aspect of life during that time. At first glance, they may seem like something from a storybook, filled with elegance and grandeur. But peel back the layers of history, and you'll see a much darker reality. For many, marriage was a prison, one that stripped away their rights, their voices, and often their sense of self-worth. The power imbalance in Victorian marriages was staggering, especially for women. Love and companionship, which we often associate with marriage today, took a back seat to duty, social status, and control. The idea that a woman's identity could be swallowed by her husband's, that she was expected to obey, is a chilling reminder of how far we've come, but also how much work was done to get here. Women were expected to serve their husbands, manage their households, and raise their children, without the freedom to own property, make decisions, or even seek a divorce if they were unhappy. And for many, dissatisfaction meant a lifetime of silence, loneliness, and often abuse. These marriages were built on gender roles that constrained the freedom of both men and women, though more acutely for women. Men were expected to be the financial providers, while women were confined to domestic duties. Yet, even for men, the idea of a perfect marriage didn't come without its own pressures. The institution of marriage was just as much about securing family wealth and ensuring legacy as it was about love, leaving little room for personal fulfillment or emotional connection. The emotional toll was enormous. Women were often isolated, both physically and emotionally, confined to their homes with no opportunity for meaningful interaction with the world. Many men, focused on careers and social standing, became emotionally distant. This lack of emotional intimacy left both parties trapped in marriages that lacked mutual affection or connection. Loneliness and resentment festered in these relationships, leaving many to wonder if they'd ever see the warmth of real companionship. Victorian marriage reflected deep societal issues, inequities of gender, class, and power. These limitations, especially for women, kept them in subjugation. Today, we see how far society has come, but remnants of these old systems still affect us. Understanding this history shows both our progress and the work still needed to ensure love, equality, and respect in modern marriages. If this history intrigued you, subscribe to keep uncovering hidden truths from the past.